Okay, so let's start talking about how exactly the overall life cycle of a request works in Spring Boot application. Sometimes, probably like in some maybe service-based company interviews, sometimes people tend to ask this kind of a question that what happens when a request actually comes up to a Spring Boot application and how exactly all of these things work. So let's start figuring that out. So whenever any client, let's say you have a front-end client, like you have a React front-end application, or maybe you're using Postman anywhere from any type of a client, you are initiating a request. When you send a request to a Spring Boot application altogether, then it's not like the request is directly collected on the controller. It's not that simple. What happens is that this request actually goes to an internal class called as dispatcher. This is an internal Spring Boot class. Okay, you can see it's an internal Spring class. Now, what is the role of this dispatcher? So dispatcher class actually reads the network request and it actually parses it. So like it sees that, okay, what is the URL, or I would say, what is the route that you want to hit? What is the type of the method? All of these crucial piece of information that helps us to classify the request properly. It reads all of that. Once it has done the reading, what it does is it passes that request, parsed request, to something called as a URL handling mapping, or you can say URL handler or URL handling mapper. What is the role of this mapper? You can say it's kind of like an internal routing layer. It's kind of like an internal routing layer for Spring Boot. This mapping actually contains the track of which route is served by which particular method of a controller, right? Because we just do the annotation of @get @post, but this annotation actually gets registered with the URL handler or URL handling mapper, which actually tells where exactly for a particular route you have to hit the method for, which method is going to be hit for a particular route. Okay. And it actually tells the corresponding controller as well that, okay, this method of this particular controller is going to be expected for a particular route. For example, let's say that, let's say you have any service. For example, let's say I have this dummy service open. If I go here to any controller, for example, okay, so you can say there's this controller called as location controller. So whenever a request will come for, let's say, /API/location/driver, this kind of a stuff, then what is going to happen is that this request is going to be parsed by the dispatcher and will be forwarded to the mapper. This mapper is going to tell that, okay, for this particular type of a URL, for a GET request, what is the controller you need to actually check and which method. And then it returns these details to the dispatcher. Then dispatcher forwards the request to the controller and the method of the controller that is given by the URL handler. For example, in this case, the method that will be told is going to be this send driver location method of location controller. So we are going to know that, okay, which controller and what particular method we are going to hit on inside that controller, and dispatcher is going to forward the request to that controller. Now, once the request comes to the controller, now the controller is going to execute all of the things. It will communicate to service for the business logic. Service will communicate to the repository. All of those things will happen. And then you can say, like, the controller actually sends back a corresponding response. And this response is later then sent back to the client. Nowadays, because most of the application that we do is API driven, right? We do not have dedicated views involved in the backend application altogether, right? Otherwise, there is an additional layer of view modeling that controller actually forwards the request to, but we don't need to care about that for now. If you are making APIs through Spring Boot, what you have to understand is that dispatcher collects the network request, parses it, forwards it to a URL handling mapper. This mapper will tell you that, okay, this particular function is going to be executed for this type of a request, and then dispatcher forwards that request to the controller does all the remaining job and gives the response back to the dispatcher, and dispatcher gives the response back to the user. Okay, if there is an additional view layer, then there is additional view model calls that is expected to be done, but for an API driven application you don't need to do that. And that's how exactly a request response lifecycle inside a Spring Boot application specifically works.